In the summer of 1941, German officers gathered in briefing rooms from Paris to Berlin, confident that the industrial balance of the war was already decided. France had fallen. Britain was contained. The Soviet Union was being driven back at a pace that seemed unstoppable. And across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral, loud in rhetoric, slow in action, and, in German eyes, fundamentally unprepared for modern industrial war. Reports from intelligence officers painted America as wealthy but inefficient, technologically capable but politically divided. To many in the German high command, American industry was something to be mocked rather than feared. They had factories, yes, but not discipline. They had machines, but no urgency. The idea that the United States could outproduce Germany in a sustained, high-intensity war was dismissed openly in officer circles. German planners believed war was won by experience, not scale. Their victories in Poland and France reinforced this belief. Precision, doctrine, and veteran leadership had crushed larger armies before. Why would America be any different? German officers joked that Americans needed committees to decide what to build and years to figure out how to build it. Luftwaffe commanders, confident in their seasoned air crews and battle-tested aircraft, saw no reason to fear an enemy that had not yet fought a single major air campaign in Europe. Even as President Roosevelt expanded aid through Lend-Lease, German leadership interpreted it as desperation, not preparation. Supplies sent to Britain were seen as symbolic gestures, not the foundation of a machine that was only just beginning to turn. What the Germans failed to grasp was not America's capacity, but its timing. The United States did not need to match Germany plane for plane in 1941. It needed to build a system that could produce aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. While German factories were already operating near maximum capacity, American industry was still shifting gears. Automobile plants, appliance factories, and steel mills were being redesigned at a pace unseen in history. Assembly lines that once produced cars began producing aircraft engines. Workers who had never seen a bomber blueprint were suddenly building components for machines that would soon cross oceans. None of this was visible to German reconnaissance. There were no bombers yet filling the sky, no formations yet crossing Europe. Just silence. And that silence was mistaken for weakness. Inside Germany, confidence hardened into arrogance. Luftwaffe officers argued that even if American bombers reached Europe, they would be poorly flown, poorly escorted, and easy targets for experienced German fighter pilots. The assumption was simple: quality would always beat quantity. What they did not consider was what happens when quantity reaches a scale where losses stop mattering. Germany's air war doctrine depended on efficiency. Every pilot, every aircraft counted. The American approach would be different: brutal, relentless, mathematical. And by the time German officers realized that American industry was not ramping up for a single battle, but for a war of exhaustion, it was already too late to stop it. The laughter didn't stop immediately. In 1942, German intelligence still underestimated American output figures, assuming propaganda exaggeration. Early American bombing raids were dismissed as clumsy and ineffective. Losses were high. Crews were inexperienced. The skies over Europe did not yet look dangerous, but beneath the surface, the equation was changing. Each month, American factories produced more aircraft than the previous one. Each month, training programs expanded. Each month, the number of airfields in Britain quietly multiplied. The system was not built for elegance. It was built for inevitability. German officers believed they were watching an opponent learn how to fight. In reality, they were watching an opponent prepare to drown them in metal. And soon, the skies would make that clear. The first American bombers did not arrive over Europe like a storm. They arrived like a test. In late 1942, small formations of B-17 flying fortresses began flying daylight missions over occupied France and Germany. To German fighter pilots watching from the ground, they looked unimpressive, slow, bulky, and flying in tight boxes that seemed easy to penetrate. Luftwaffe veterans had already destroyed British bombers in large numbers during earlier phases of the war. Compared to that, these American aircraft appeared naive. German pilots joked that the Americans flew like they were on parade. Anti-aircraft crews welcomed the chance to practice on large, predictable targets. Losses among the early American bomber groups were heavy, exactly as German commanders expected, and those losses reinforced the belief that American air power would never scale. But what German officers misunderstood was that these early raids were not meant to win the air war. They were meant to gather data. American planners were learning in real time how formations held under fire, how crews reacted to losses, how long engines could sustain damage, how German fighters attacked. Each downed bomber was not simply a loss. It was a data point fed back into a production system that could adjust faster than German doctrine ever allowed. While German pilots celebrated each kill, American factories quietly responded by modifying designs, reinforcing armor, improving defensive gun placements, and accelerating output. The Germans were fighting aircraft. The Americans were refining a system. By 1943, the scale began to shift. Bomber formations grew larger. Escort fighters extended their range. Training programs produced crews faster than Germany could replace experienced pilots. American bombers did not arrive sporadically anymore. They arrived daily. And when German fighters shot down 10, 20, even 30 bombers in a single raid, more appeared the next day. The Luftwaffe's core advantage, veteran pilots, began to erode. Each interception cost Germany men it could not replace. Each bomber cost America metal that was already being replaced before the wreckage hit the ground. The arithmetic was brutal, and it favored only one side. German officers started noticing something unsettling. American bombing accuracy was improving, not declining. Crews that survived one mission returned sharper, more disciplined. New crews arrived already trained on updated tactics. Factories in the United States were now producing bombers faster than Germany could count them. Intelligence reports warned of production figures that seemed impossible. Senior officers dismissed them as exaggerations, until reconnaissance photos showed airfields in Britain packed wingtip to wingtip with aircraft. The skies were no longer empty between raids. They were crowded. The laughter began to fade quietly. Luftwaffe commanders stopped talking about teaching the Americans a lesson and started discussing fuel shortages, pilot fatigue, and aircraft attrition. German fighters were flying more missions with fewer experienced men. Replacement pilots were younger, less trained, and thrown into combat against formations that never seemed to shrink. What had once felt like manageable pressure now felt endless. The Americans were not trying to win in one decisive strike. They were suffocating the Luftwaffe by forcing it to respond again and again until it broke. By the end of 1943, the question inside German command circles was no longer whether American industry was a threat. It was how anyone had failed to see it coming. The skies were filling, not with a single raid, but with inevitability. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had crossed a threshold German officers could no longer explain away. What they were facing was no longer an enemy force. It was an industrial phenomenon. American bomber streams now crossed the Channel in numbers that defied every pre-war assumption about what sustained air operations looked like. Hundreds of aircraft appeared at once, layered in altitude, protected by escorts that no longer turned back at the German border. The introduction of long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang removed the Luftwaffe's last comfortable advantage. German pilots who once waited for bombers to separate from their escorts now found American fighters above them, beside them, and behind them for the entire mission. For the first time since the war began, German airspace was no longer theirs to control. The shift was devastating. Luftwaffe commanders had built their doctrine around efficiency. Carefully timed interceptions, limited engagements, pilots preserved for future battles. American industry shattered that logic. Every interception now came at a cost Germany could not afford. A single lost German fighter pilot represented years of training, experience, and institutional memory. A lost American bomber crew represented tragedy, but not paralysis. New crews arrived constantly. Aircraft replacements flowed uninterrupted. The United States did not fight to conserve strength. It fought to overwhelm the equation itself. German officers began to realize that they were not losing because of inferior tactics or aircraft. They were losing because the scale had become unmanageable. Factories deep inside Germany began to feel the consequences. Precision bombing targets expanded from airfields and ports to ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, and transportation hubs. Each successful raid created cascading effects: fewer spare parts, less fuel, slower repairs. Even when damage appeared limited, production schedules slipped. Repairs took longer, shortages multiplied. German industry, already stretched thin, could not recover between raids. American bombers returned again and again, forcing factories to shut down during daylight hours or disperse production inefficiently. The skies themselves had become a blockade, one enforced not by ships, but by metal and mathematics. Inside German command meetings, tone replaced confidence. Officers who once laughed at American production figures now argued over which targets to defend and which to abandon. Fighter units were relocated constantly, chasing bomber streams that seemed to appear everywhere at once. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day with dwindling fuel reserves and increasing fatigue. Accidents rose. Training standards dropped. Young pilots with minimal flight hours were sent into combat against veteran American formations supported by radar, escorts, and overwhelming numbers. The Luftwaffe was being consumed not by defeat in a single battle, but by continuous exposure to an enemy that never paused. What made the situation unbearable was predictability. German officers could now forecast losses before engagements even began. Intercepting meant losing pilots. Not intercepting meant losing factories. There was no winning option. American industry had turned air power into a certainty rather than a gamble. The very thing German officers had once mocked, America's obsession with mass production, had become the war's most decisive weapon. The skies over Germany no longer represented danger that could be mitigated. They represented pressure that could only increase. By the time Allied leaders prepared for D-Day, the Luftwaffe was already broken in ways no invasion could fix. Air superiority had been decided not on the beaches of Normandy, but months earlier in American factories and training fields thousands of miles away. German officers finally understood the mistake they had made, not when the first bombers appeared, but when they kept coming and never stopped. And there was nothing left to laugh at. By the spring of 1944, German officers were no longer debating American industrial capacity. They were calculating how long Germany could survive under it. What had once been dismissed as exaggerated production claims now appeared in daily operational reports. Bomber formations numbering in the hundreds, escorted by fighters that arrived early and stayed late. Air raid sirens became routine. Civilian morale eroded. Industrial output declined not because factories were destroyed outright, but because workers could no longer operate under constant threat. The German war economy, built for precision and efficiency, was being forced into fragmentation, production dispersed, schedules disrupted, logistics strained beyond recovery. The skies had become an environment Germany could not control, and that loss of control infected every other front. Inside the Luftwaffe, the cost was catastrophic. Veteran pilots were gone. Those who remained were exhausted, flying outdated aircraft with insufficient fuel and limited maintenance. Training pipelines collapsed under pressure, producing pilots who barely had time to learn formation flying before being sent into combat. German officers who once spoke confidently about air superiority now spoke in terms of damage limitation. Which cities could be spared? Which factories were expendable? Which fighter units could still be redeployed without breaking entirely? These were not questions of victory. They were questions of survival. And all the while, American bomber production continued to climb. Losses that would have crippled any other air force barely slowed the United States. The imbalance was total. What haunted German planners most was the realization that there had been a window to act, and it had closed years earlier. In 1941, American industry was still mobilizing. In 1942, it was accelerating. By 1943, it was unstoppable. Germany had gambled on quick wars, decisive campaigns, and psychological dominance. American industry answered with endurance, repetition, and scale. The German officer corps had misjudged not American technology, but American patience. The United States did not rush. It prepared. And when it entered the war fully, it did so with a machine designed not to intimidate, but to exhaust every enemy assumption until nothing remained. As D-Day approached, the outcome was already written in the sky. Allied troops crossed the Channel under air cover the Luftwaffe could barely contest. German armored units moved by night, hiding from aircraft that hunted anything that moved by day. Supply lines fractured, communications failed. The invasion succeeded not only because of bravery on the beaches, but because the air war had stripped Germany of the ability to respond at scale. German officers who had once laughed at American industry now watched their defenses collapse under its weight. The laughter had turned into silence, the kind that follows realization. Germany did not lose the air war because it lacked courage or intelligence. It lost because it misjudged what modern war had become. The decisive battles were no longer fought only at the front. They were fought in factories, training fields, and supply chains. And in that arena, the United States had entered the war already prepared to win. By the end of 1944, German officers no longer spoke about stopping American bombers. The conversation had shifted to endurance, how long factories could function, how long fuel reserves could last, how long pilots could keep flying. The skies over Germany were no longer contested space, they were dominated territory. Bomber streams arrived with such regularity that air defenses became reactive rather than strategic. Even when German fighters achieved local success, it changed nothing. The next day, the bombers returned. And the day after that. American industry had turned air warfare into a condition rather than an event, something Germany had to live under continuously, without relief. What finally became clear inside German command circles was that the mistake had not been tactical or technological. It had been conceptual. German officers had believed war could still be decided the way it had been in 1940, through rapid campaigns, decisive blows, and the collapse of enemy morale. American industry represented a different philosophy entirely. It did not seek the perfect strike. It sought persistence. Losses were anticipated, budgeted, and absorbed. Aircraft were not precious assets to be preserved. They were expendable tools in a system designed to keep functioning regardless of cost. German doctrine could not compete with that logic. It had never been built to. As the Allied armies advanced across France and into Germany itself, the effects of American industrial dominance were everywhere. Armored units lacked fuel. Aircraft were grounded for lack of spare parts. Transportation networks collapsed under sustained bombing. German commanders issued orders that could not be executed because the means no longer existed. Even when German soldiers fought with discipline and determination, they did so without air cover, without reliable supply, and without the ability to maneuver freely. The war had become asymmetrical in the most unforgiving way. One side still had options, the other had none. In retrospect, the moment Germany lost the war did not occur on the beaches of Normandy, in the ruins of Berlin, or even in the skies over the Reich. It occurred years earlier, when German officers laughed at American industry, when they mistook silence for weakness, when they failed to understand that modern war rewards those who prepare for endurance rather than brilliance. By the time the skies filled with bombers, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The bombers were not the beginning of defeat, they were the proof that it had already happened. The lesson endured long after the war ended. Power in modern conflict is not defined solely by weapons or tactics, but by the ability to produce, replace, and sustain them indefinitely. Germany entered the war believing experience would always defeat scale. American industry proved the opposite. It did not just build bombers, it built inevitability. And by the time German officers realized what they were facing, there was nothing left to do but watch the sky and understand that the laughter had cost them everything.